Good afternoon, everyone. We'll be starting in about 2 minutes. Thank you.
I might have to leave right at like 2:20 or right just there'll be another place at 2:30, but just so you know, I'm not any quicker. And is Joyce coming?
Joyce said she would be late by 20 minutes. Is this working? Hello and welcome. Yes. Hello and welcome to another session of the at our joint CGIAR FAO Pavilion. Today, what happened? Today we are going to talk on a very important topic that is a subject of negotiation happening right now at the UNFCCC COP29. And what we are going to talk about is about synergies between the UNFCCC GGA Expert Group that has been appointed recently and the adaptation methodology report that the IPCC AR7 cycle has been mandated to produce during this AR7 cycle. So we have two processes, kind of parallel processes with intersections, we hope. And both of these processes are actually trying to look at how do we measure adaptation? What are the best indicators for adaptation? How we actually take the discussions around adaptation forward. So just to give you a little background, okay, let me introduce myself. My name is Dr. Aditi Mukherjee. I work with the CGIAR and I lead our climate platform, which brings together the CG's climate work under one umbrella. So today we are discussing about the GGA framework around adaptation as well as the IPCC's mandated work on adaptation in the next few years. So just a bit of a background, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that's UNFCCC, has recently appointed 78 experts to refine the global goal on adaptation indicators, focusing on 7 thematic targets and the adaptation policy cycle. Of these 7 thematic targets, a lot of those targets are of deep interest to the food agriculture community. We have targets on water, we have targets on food, but we also have targets on health, ecosystems, and livelihoods, and poverty. So all of those are very central to the kind of work that we do at the CGIAR and at the FAO. So at the same time, in January 2024, in Turkey, the IPCC approved a set of scientific reports for its 7th assessment cycle, in which one of the reports that was announced was a report dedicated to revising the 1994 IPCC Technical Guidelines on impacts and adaptation, as well as a focus on adaptation indicators, metrics, and guidelines. So we have a UNFCCC setup process, plus we have an IPCC process, both focusing on adaptation. So in today's session, we have some speakers who are from the technical expert group on adaptation, as well as we have representatives from the IPCC. So we are going to discuss, are there significant opportunities to harmonize the efforts between IPCC's review of adaptation methods and the UNFCCC's work on adaptation indicators through the expert engagement? So this session in sum aims to bring together experts involved in both the UNFCCC process and the IPCC Bureau members, including Vice Chair of the IPCC Working Group 2. So basically the point would be to discuss the points of alignment and explore how two processes can mutually benefit from each other. So with that, I want to hand over the session. So from within the CG, two of the 78 experts, very glad to say that the CGIAR has two of them. Both of them are in the room, one being myself, I'm on the water part, and Lucy from Alliance, she's doing the food one. So Lucy, please feel free to chip in the discussion today. Before I want to now welcome Cristina Rumbaitis Del Rio. She's the Senior Advisor, Adaptation and Resilience at the UN Foundation. And Cristina is deeply, deeply involved in the UNFCCC GGA track, and she knows more about it than I feel a lot of us who have been doing it more recently. So Cristina has nearly 20 years of experience developing and implementing climate change adaptation and resilience program. And immediately prior to her role in the United Nations Foundation, she was a senior adaptation and resilience advisor with the World Resources Institute and an international engagement associate with the FOLU. And she's also a board member of the World Fish. So I hand over this meeting to Cristina to do the moderation. Over to you, if you need.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Aditi. Yes, I'm a very proud member of the board of World Fish and very delighted to be speaking within the CGIAR pavilion today on this really important topic. And we're really lucky to have a number of the technical experts selected for the GGA technical working groups here with us, as well as IPCC members, and trying to draw the connections between the two. And indeed, we have an IPCC meeting coming up in just a few weeks, a scoping meeting coming up in just a few weeks in Malaysia. So this is a very opportune time for this conversation. I'd like to introduce our panel, our first panel, and call up the panelists here. We have Inkar. Please say your last name so I don't mispronounce it.
Kadyrjanova.
Kadyrjanova, thank you. Did I do okay? Great. Inkar is a Senior Natural Resources Officer at the Food and Agriculture Organization and Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and the Environment. She's the team lead on climate change policy and strategy at the FAO. Office of Climate Change and Biodiversity and the Environment. And then before joining FAO, she worked as a Gender and Climate Advisor at the UN Women Office for Asia and Pacific, where she led the work on regional gender mainstreaming in climate and disaster risk reduction. So excellent to have you here and to have your perspectives. Next, I'd like to invite Dr. Animesh Kumar, who is the head of the UNDRR office in Bonn. Animesh manages the organization's global portfolio on climate action and comprehensive risk management, disaster data, monitoring of the Sendai framework and the SDGs. And he brings a wealth of experience to UNDRR, having served as deputy head of the UNDRR regional offices in both Africa and Asia Pacific. Welcome, Animesh. Please have a seat. Our next speaker that we're lucky to have is Dr. Portia Adade Williams, who is a research scientist with the science and, sorry, let me move this so you can have a seat, Portia. So Portia is a research scientist with the Science and Technical Policy Research Institute of the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in Accra, Ghana. She is a climate adaptation expert with a PhD from the University of Cape Town. She was a contributing author to the sixth assessment report of the IPCC Working Group 2, and also a contributing author on the 2022-2032 Africa Union's Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plans. And online, I think we have to supplement. We have Ms. Neha Rai as a climate change and private sector specialist in the NEST team of the Office of Climate Change, Biodiversity and Environment of FAO. Neha is a climate change and private sector specialist with more than 15 years of experience working in adaptation planning, climate finance and policy. She's currently focusing on private sector engagement in implementing national climate plans, NDCs, and national adaptation plans. and she was previously a senior researcher at IIED on climate finance and MNE. So really delighted to have the four of you here on this panel. Maybe I'll start with a quick round of reflections from each of you on where we are in the process for the various technical working groups, both within the negotiations, but also the work of the technical working groups. There's been a lot done in recent weeks. I know you've filtered lots of indicators and reviewed them. So would love to hear kind of top-line messages from that process in terms of where things are at from your respective working groups. Portia, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Thank you very much, Christina, and happy to be here today to share some reflections on the work that we have been doing with the UAE Belém work program on indicators. So I'm working with the Poverty and Livelihoods Group. That's working with Target 9F, as we say, and poverty and livelihoods. I think the main target there is to see how we can adversely reduce impact of climate on poverty reduction and also on livelihoods, and in effect promotes adaptive social protection measures. So that is what the Poverty and Livelihoods group is looking at. And so we were thrown with almost 400 indicators coming from what the Secretariat, UNFCCC Secretariat put together, in addition to what the Adaptation Committee worked on. And then with that, a number of duplicates were removed. And then finally, we were left with about 391 indicators to work with as a group of 7 experts. And this is experts coming from different geographical representation. And so I think our work was quite simple and straightforward at this time after going around with a lot of uncertainties about the work. We had to look at the relevance of the indicators we were given to the target I just talked about. And so we went through it, and of course, as different experts coming from different areas looking at these indicators, we agreed and disagreed on a number of them. And then I would say, I think with what the instructions given us, we are to just say whether it's relevant, it's not relevant. That is yes, no, and then maybe, if maybe we feel the indicator could be looked at again from different perspectives, because probably there might be issues. And so we did that, and I would say that from the group of 7 experts, we had, in terms of relevance to the indicator, we had about 93 of the 391 indicators being yes, we feel it's directly relevant to the target. In terms of no, direct no and can be considered, we had about 59 of them. And then we come to the point of maybe, where some feel it is, some feel it's not, and so as a group we could not agree on. That was about 149. And so that is what we presented to the Secretariat after going through the indicators, mapping them. But then what I would say is, giving it to them, we also we saw some few issues that we highlighted. I would say that firstly, we saw that we are looking at global goal on adaptation, and so we are looking at something very global and should be very applicable widely. But then I think one key point was that we saw that most of the indicators were more context specific to specific areas, geographical areas, and even to specific countries. So you see maybe indicators speaking directly to, let's say, mountainous areas. And so what about those down the valley? That would not really be directly applicable. Poverty kind of is also relevant to a number of the themes. So you see that poverty indicators might have positive outcomes for food security and also for health outcomes, and even for other thematic areas. So we saw that some of the indicators we were looking at in our group were not really directly relevant for poverty. And so we flagged all those ones that went to the Secretariat. We also realized that it was more like general on climate risk that had to do with more like mitigation and not really targeting directly adaptation. And generally, some of the indicators were more like questions put than seeing the indicator as an indicator where you could easily track progress with it. And so all these we kind of highlighted and have presented to the group. But then quickly linking it to the process now, I think at the point that we presented our report, we had a few questions that we put forward. We wanted answers to. That I'm glad that so far with how negotiations are going, I can happily say it's been answered, because we were working, but we were not sure of what would be the end goal. What are the indicators even meant for? What is the purpose of the indicators? I think it's something that we struggle very much as experts, and so we put that forward. And happily to say that with negotiations ongoing, it's becoming much clearer what actually parties are looking for from at the end of the day. And also, I think the last point I would touch on that we also flagged was we weren't sure of the scope of the work, the timelines, what is the deliverable that we need to deliver at the end of the day. And to mention that we had a number of criteria, but we could just subject the work we did to only 2. And so we flagged all that. And then I think with negotiations going so far for the past over a week, it's becoming much clearer to us what is expected of us at the end of the day. Let me just end it here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Portia. Yeah, it's fascinating to hear about the experience. The technical experts have been working under time pressure with very unclear instructions on, is it global targets? Is it national targets? Is it a list of 100, 1,000, 10 that you're supposed to come up with? So glad to hear that clarity is starting to emerge. From looking at the different reports that were produced by the technical expert groups, I was struck by the differences between the groups. There were definitely some different methodologies followed and different gaps that were highlighted. So maybe just to highlight so that we don't duplicate each other on the process, but if you could highlight, Animesh, I'm turning to you, on some of the key findings from the health technical expert report.
Thanks, Christina. I think Portia has already covered a lot of points, which I don't think we're very different across different expert groups. Yes, of course, the entire Excel sheet that when we received first, I think we slept over it because 10,000 indicators is where we started. So we then got up again and said, okay, let's have a look. So we, when we filtered, we found a total of around 750 indicators under health. The criteria that were given to us, then we applied them and at the end filtered out 300, resulting in 400. And then that's the process we have followed. While submitting our report, we weighed our language very well from the expert group that we have filtered, applied the criteria given to us in assessing the indicators. We categorically mentioned in bold that this is in no way a recommendation from the expert group on the selection of the indicators. Why so? Because we saw a lot of challenges, and the challenges are shared perhaps across different expert groups. The good part was that whenever we found a good indicator where we saw, okay, this is something which definitely should make the cut, were all the SDG indicators. All the indicators in the Sendai framework, SDG indicators were making the first cut right away. It goes on to show that the institutional experience we have gained in the last 8 years of SDG implementation, Sendai implementation, WHO indicator metric processes and so on has really helped us mature in our understanding, and hence we do have the right level of understanding to do so. But perhaps the good story ended there. The challenges we had was, one, many of the, I'm looking for the word, statements, which were there in the list of indicators were making the cut because they could have got a tick against the 2 criteria given to us, but they were not indicators. So how to do about it, because we were not given a very specific instruction on how to manage, and we have raised that multiple times in the group meetings as well, including in the all expert group meetings. So the challenge was that either their outcomes or their statements or phrases, but they're not indicators. So we have made a note on those indicators that perhaps they will make the cut, but we have our caveats against those indicators. The second set of challenges with indicators which made the cut were like, okay, fabulous, very nice, smart indicators, but there is neither a methodology nor data against those indicators. They will make the cut, but are we doing a disservice to the governments, the countries and parties by suggesting indicators for which we don't have method nor data, Statistics is a very slow moving process. It takes years and years to develop the right matrix and then start collecting data. If we go for those indicators, worry is that we will not have data before the next 5 years. So that's the experience we have. If I just put forward example from our own experience in Sendai framework, we have indicators out of 38 indicators where more than 150 countries are reporting consistently over the last 8 years. We have indicators for which less than 50 countries are reporting as of now. And it goes on to show that and those are those indicators where we didn't have adequate methodology and then data did not come up. So that is something which we also had in mind. The third category were those indicators where we were too context specific. It might be very interesting, there is a methodology, there is very good data in that micro scale, but how do we scale it up? How do we make it a global goal? I think that was a challenge again, and we liked those indicators and those made the cut, but are we talking about global goal? And if we are talking about global goal, then can we use a micro level community centric indicator as the basis to measure a global goal? How does it add up? So those were some of the challenges that we did face. In terms of our working modality, what we did was to further look into those 700 plus indicators. And within the expert group, we saw who specializes in what kind of indicators. For example, in UNDRR, we are very good in impact because we deal with disasters. And hence, we took over all those 300 plus indicators which had anything to do with impact. But within impact, we have to subdivide because there are direct impacts and there are impacts which are health impact but may or may not be related to climate change. For example, people dying or getting affected because of heat waves is a direct impact, and we are recording that information. People dying or affected because of cholera, how far do you attribute to the climate change? I think impacts also differed over different categories of the same subcategories of the same set of indicators. A second category of indicators which we found was intervention related, like implementation monitoring, service related, service delivery of health services and so on, which again were the second level, and many of them indicators were meeting those criteria. And the third were very specific contextual indicators, which also we had to have different other experts looking into it. So yes, we face the challenges. I think the directions we are receiving through the draft text that we are seeing online is much more clear than we had till June, and at least till last 1 week before the COP. So I hope that with the new direction and new guidance, we can actually move forward towards the June meeting next year. The road is a bit ambitious. It's not very even. There's still a lot of gray areas here and there. But perhaps I'll leave that because I would want to deep dive further into those gray areas later on. Thanks.
Oh, sorry. Let me just grab it real quick just to say we're going to take questions from the audience in just a moment. So if you do have questions, please hold on to them. And thank you, Animesh, for raising a lot of the issues around data, disaggregation, methods, those attribution to climate. That's going to be something that definitely is relevant to discuss in the context of the IPCC guidelines. But next I want to turn to Inkar to get your perspective from food and ag, and Neha will turn to you after.
Exactly. Thank you so much for the floor. And maybe before I start my intervention, I actually want to say that I'm not really working on this task in FAO. I just happen to be a staff that is currently available to come in person. So the real people who live the work, they're led by Neha. Neha is here on the screen. So I will just share a few introductory statements and views on FAO's experience in supporting the expert group, and then we'll hand over to Neha because she's the one who actually has done the work, right? And I understand that many of the issues that FAO has faced while working as part of the expert group on food and agriculture are very similar to what Portia and Animesh have mentioned earlier. Colleagues were really overwhelmed by the number of indicators that have been provided. Over 1,800 indicators were assessed as relevant to food and agriculture under the criteria 12A and relevant to adaptation under the criteria 12B. And as a result result of the assessment, it was proven that nearly 2/3 of the indicators, or 63%, were tagged as relevant to food and agriculture target under target 9B. And over 62% were tagged for their relevance to adaptation, and they focus on the enhanced adaptive capacity, strengthening resilience, and reducing vulnerability to climate change. So with regard to those indicators which were labeled as maybe and no, colleagues have realized that there are several categories, and I hear that the previous speakers have also pointed out that those indicators that fell into these two categories, maybe and no, they either lacked a clear or direct link to agri-food systems, or they were too general, or they were too difficult in terms of being measurable indicators with the limited scalability or applicability at the national level. Some of them were ambiguous or poorly structured, and it was very difficult to assess the relevance to agri-food system adaptation more specifically. And additionally, some indicators required better framing or revision to be better connected in an explicit way to climate change adaptation. So the final assessment that a lot more work needs to be done, especially after the COP, and FAO is following the progress of the negotiations under the GGA. But maybe more specifically on the next steps, I think we can ask Neha to comment. Yeah, Neha, over to you. Neha, do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. So basically, it's on the next steps, right?
Yes, and the next steps that you see.
Yes, I think as the expert group, seeks further guidance from parties to really refine the indicators, which I think will become more clearer after the COP29, the group, the expert group, which comprises of Lucy and many others who are present here, has identified key priorities for the continued refinement of adaptation indicators. And I think there are a couple of things that we have been thinking of going further. One is to adopt a two-tiered indicator structure where we will now, out of the 63% indicators, which are approximately around 1,100 indicators, we will group them into core categories supported by specific actionable metrics to balance global assessment with national priorities. So, for example, practical metrics that can respond to agri-food system terminology, so production, supply, nutrition, and access, and also to core indicators within these four categories, because at the moment when we did the assessment, it was mostly on production side of indicators, but nothing on supply, post-harvest handling, and entire agri-food system as a chain, which was lacking. The second thing we would like to also work on is apply additional refinement criteria. So, for example, we had SP criteria on adaptation relevance and contribution to food and agriculture, but there are other criteria like data readiness, inclusion of local knowledge, indigenous populations, and indicator functions like whether they are input, output, outcome. So going further as experts, we would like to work on these additional refinement criteria which were not used in the previous stages. The third thing is on managing duplications. There were a lot of duplications in the earlier version, which was assessed. But the reason why there were duplication was also for two reasons. One was because it was submitted by parties within three different channels like Agnes Group, AGN Group, as well as LDC groups had similar indicators, but through different submissions. So we would like to get rid of duplications going further and making sure that indicators which come across have been mentioned several times can be removed, but at the same time indicators mentioned by different parties can have more strength going further because they are the ones which are mentioned by a range of parties. The other thing going further, which we want to focus on, is coordinating cross-cutting indicators, so that span across multiple sectors, example, water, food, ecosystems, and engage with expert groups to resolve overlaps and assign responsibilities. So the idea would be bring together these experts and activate the SP 20 clause of bringing together experts so that we can have more in-depth in-person discussions to further refine these indicators. And many of us, including Aditi, Lucy, and Christina, are in conversation on this agenda. And thereby, lastly, I would just like to mention that simplify the indicators a bit and shift from more output-focused metrics to those emphasizing long-term outcomes. So we are ensuring relevance to climate adaptation, not only as output-based indicators, but impact-based indicators, which I think Animesh also highlighted quite a bit earlier. I think that's it from our side in terms of
Thanks.
next steps.
Yeah, thanks, Nika. I think that's really clear to see some of the thinking on next steps, and I think we'll get into that a little bit further. I want to see if there's any questions for the audience. We'll take a couple of questions and have a couple minutes for answers. I'll ask a first question for you to think about. Since we're here trying to make the link between the GGA process and the IPCC guidelines process, what advice would you have for the IPCC, or are there particular things the IPCC guidelines can do to support thinking over the long term countries in better measuring progress on adaptation? And so some ideas there. I saw some hands up. Oh my goodness. Okay, we'll try and take as many as we can.
Yeah, my name is Tình from Alliance of Biodiversity in Seattle, and also the member for the technical support in the Vietnam delegation in the COP and also UN food system. Because ideally, I love the topic because you have the term synergies of different things together like food, etc. I also listen carefully. You emphasize different challenges and also issue at the country level because we also recognize the challenges in terms of the movement for the synergies. However, besides with national and local, much more challenges again at implementation level. Because on the thing at the national level, they do for commitment at global scale, they need to be implemented. And how to be implemented. And there is no existing mechanism right now to support countries effectively to find more synergies and less trade-off of those terms at implementation stage. So I hope that it is possible because you own expert and you understand well already at national and local, but please also pay attention upcoming time to think more about the indicator, more actionable, more like how they link you should think about several layers. If we focus more on some indicator related to the output level, and which output can contribute more different outcome in food, in food system, in nutrition, and also climate. That's really important for the country at upcoming time. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So how can we incorporate outputs and drive greater implementation through these indicator sets? I'll come to you next.
Thank you so much. My name is Antonis Kolimenakis. I'm a member of the Climate Change and Health team at WHO. My question is to Animesh. I think certainly one thing we need to enhance, and that is a great event, by the way, is to enhance the coordination among different partners that are involved in the process. So in this respect, I also find it extremely useful to link the processes between the indicators and the IPCC, because that actually addresses one of the questions you posed on the cholera. So if we have the evidence through the IPCC reports that, just giving an example of cholera, that cholera is linked to climate change and health, I think then we have the justification on how some indicators qualify to be in this respect. In addition, I have some bad news that we have more indicators which have not yet been incorporated by the UNFCCC they were somehow not acknowledged, but they will be now incorporated. So the number 700 might become 1,000. So no, I mean, this is though just to emphasize how we need to coordinate to filter, because I also very much echo the cross-cutting issue that we need to narrow down so that it is easier for countries to be able to track. My last point is regarding this monitoring and tracking. Several of the indicators that at least have come from our side through some of the experts that are involved are related to the overall monitoring mechanism of countries. I give the very wide example of vulnerability and adaptation assessments and health national adaptation plans, which for which we are having a several years monitoring process with countries. So presumably these are country-driven processes, and I think there is no question whether or not these should be incorporated as country priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonis. Okay, a couple questions there, but really highlighting the issue of evidence base and what that means for attribution and potential for the IPCC there. Oh my God. All right, I'm going to go to you and we'll come back to you, sir. Really briefly.
Yes. Thank you. My name is Celia Harvey. I'm the Climate Director at Rainforest Alliance. And for those of us that haven't been involved in the development of the indicators, could you just say a bit more just about what the purpose of the indicators is and how you think parties are going to use them?
You'd think that's an easy question to answer. But all right, let me throw it to our experts to start answers, and then hopefully we might have a minute or two for the remaining question. Who wants to start?
Okay, let me just kick off. I think, Christina, the question initially that you posed in terms of the role of IPCC, I think you have answered partially in terms of the work in terms of in the climate sensitivity of different hazards. I think where it becomes even more concrete is in the context of 12A, 12B, the sensitivity to climate and sensitivity of adaptation. I think I'm not sure how useful this discussion is, but how do we distinguish between development and adaptation indicators? I don't find that a very useful discussion, but we have been posed that question so many times that how then, if you're using SDGs indicators as they are, then why are the adaptation indicators, why are they not just SDG indicators? I don't have an answer. I would rather use the SDG indicators and then leave it to 10A, risk assessment part of the climate goals, to then qualify it further. But sometimes creating these artificial silos sometimes is not very helpful from the statistical point of view, and it poses a lot of challenges in terms of implementation. I think part of some of the questions that were asked, how do we drive implementation? We had a very good session earlier, Aditi, you were there as well in Water Pavilion last week, on how specific targets can actually be broken down into specific components, and those components can become the drivers of implementation. In that session, I had given a presentation on early warning systems, for example, wherein early warning systems have 4 components. Each 4 component is now an indicator under early warnings for all, and is also under GGA. And each of those indicators have a gap analysis because of the tracking system behind them, and each of the gap is converted into financing terms. And those financing becomes the basis for driving the implementation. So that's just one example, and I'm sure there could be others as well. In terms of the other question was the monitoring and evaluation system in countries and how do the countries use them. I think that goes to the larger question, what are we using these indicators for? My firm view from the very beginning, from the GLASS process since Glasgow, has been that we have a global goal and we need global indicators. The global goal has been established. We have targets established. We are developing indicators for those global goals. But the pathway to reach that global goal will differ country by country, because each country's adaptation pathway will be different. If that be the case, we cannot merge and we cannot jumble up altogether different countries' pathways in one common global goal. So the Sendai formula to that is that establish global goal, establish global targets, but let the countries decide how they want to reach there. And it's the NAPs. The NAPs will decide how do we reach there, and each NAP will have its own M&E framework, and those M&E framework may borrow indicators from the global goal through an optional process. But mixing up global indicators and global targets with national targets and national indicators confuses. It's not very helpful in the process from our own experience. And finally, how will the parties use? I think I just mentioned that my expectation will be that we will all agree collectively on global targets. That's already been done. We collectively agree on global indicators, and then there is a menu of options, and that could be 200, 1,000. We don't care. The governments can drop down, select from that menu of options, but each of those indicators will have a standard data standard methodology and matrix and so on that can be put to use. I think those are some of the points I wanted to mention as of now. Thanks.
All right, sure. I think you've touched on almost all the questions that came on the floor, but just to add on, I think yesterday there was an informal session ongoing to discuss further how critical it could be to get other relevant stakeholders involved in this process. And that is not settled yet, while some parties feel it will be very important. Others are not also seeing the relevance of this. And so I think if we are able to settle on this, I think it will be very helpful. And that's where we are throwing in invites to IPCC. There is an existing task force for adaptation, for mitigation. And I think the interest is also to get a task force for adaptation where the IPCC could push this forward. This is not something that is openly accepted easily, and so negotiations are still ongoing with that. I think if that is accepted, that would be very helpful. But then overall, you talked about the purpose, and it's very interesting topic because both parties and experts really struggle a lot when you ask what is the purpose of this. But I think he's touched a lot on that. But to say that, I think it's a global goal on adaptation that has its own aim at looking at reducing vulnerability and then increasing resilience, and also trying to see how best we can build adaptive capacity at the global level and to track progress of how we are doing with adaptation. We are doing very well with that for mitigation, but not for adaptation. So I think that is what we want to do, and these indicators are to guide us to be able to say how we are doing. And I think in a broad sense, that is what we are trying to do here. And so again, there is the need for, I think parties have agreed that we need global level indicators for each of the targets. So I'll just touch briefly on poverty. So we are looking at reducing climate, trying to reduce adverse impacts of climate on livelihoods, on poverty, and then in doing that also trying to promote responsive social protection. And so with these three key elements, I think we are going to get global level indicators that are going to help us to be able to know how we are doing very well in terms of reducing poverty, and also how it's doing with livelihoods, and again, how we are doing with social protection measures, which is quite key, and it cuts across most of the other targets we have. I think I'll end that here. Thank you.
I don't know if Neha wants to start, or maybe I will just say a few very general points. I think the value of the science-based of the science policy interface is in the ability of academia and science to come up with the actionable metrics. And I think in these actionable metrics we have to recognize the challenges that the parties are facing with. One is how to translate the global commitments into the national action that could be further than translated into the practical projects, and also how to recognize the specificity of the local context. Many parties talk about the specific national circumstances in terms of adaptation, but we also should recognize the specific national circumstances in terms of the parties' capacity to track, to collect the data and manipulate the data, build the relevant time series. And I was involved in the review of the GSG inventories, and I know that it took parties, developed parties, more than 20 years to come up with the solid inventory data. And the IPCC assistance in that field was in coming up with the tiered methodological approaches, recognizing the level of complexity of the issue, the national circumstances, the capacity, and also adopting the step-by-step approach where parties could start with like simple methodology based on available data, maybe based on the data series with significant gaps, and then over the years improving the completeness and transparency of their reporting. And I think the same approach could also be adopted in adaptation. I guess it will be false to expect that reporting on adaptation and the metrics would be developed in one go over a short period of time. I think we have to give ourselves and to the parties or to the governments sufficient time to get familiar with this process and to be able to improve over time. But Neha, feel free to add, please, because you're the one who actually does the work.
Yes. Yeah.
No, we'll end here. Sorry, Neha. Please go ahead.
Okay, I think a couple of things I would like to highlight, especially this point around how this information can be used or the GGA indicators can be used. That it's threefold. One, countries can use this for reporting on adaptation outcomes on NDCs and NAPs. And this is something, within FAO, the M&E work that we're doing, particularly in countries like Egypt, Colombia, etc., we're trying to make sure already that the indicators that are defined at the global level are also aligned at the national level, so that later on the countries don't have to tailor their reporting mechanism. The second is on adaptation, BTR Chapter 4 of the Enhanced Transparency Framework, which focuses on adaptation. And there also within the element E, which focuses on monitoring and evaluation, having indicators for global goal of adaptation is quite crucial. And lastly, besides reporting, I think national planning and improvement and internal decision making on agriculture and food systems, it's quite important that these indicators correspond to internal decision making. And that's why so far all the work that we're trying to do is trying to make sure the national mechanisms are in sync with global reporting, so that it's helpful. Just one last thing on, as we are also discussing on this point on SDGs and development indicators and how these can be useful for adaptation reporting. One of the things we've tried to highlight in the metrics paper of FAO is also that although SDGs are very, very robust in their methodologies and the ability to show data from countries because they are already quite advanced, they are development indicators, but how can we contextualize them to make sure they're climate context indicators? So in the adaptation metrics paper of FAO, we've tried to suggest how we can normalize them and adjust them to climate data and climate risks, and not just use them as simple adaptation and development indicators. So I think that's one thing which is instrumental for all indicators being proposed under the Global Goal of Adaptation indicators so far submitted. How can we refine them to make them more climate adaptation focused? And some of the suggestions in the metrics paper is quite helpful. I advise people to look at it.
Thanks, Neha. Yeah, I think there's different points of view on how to contextualize and the logic chain that's needed. But I think a really important contribution is that it needs to be contextualized and linked to the climate to really fit in this framework. Is that correct? I see, Animesh. I think this is a point of discussion, but Animesh, I know you have a couple points to make just briefly because we're really running out of time.
Yeah, very quickly. I was going to wrap up in my last intervention, but looking at this audience, which is so well informed, I thought of leaving some of my messages as well, which we can carry forward. One is that we keep talking about these duplicates or multiple indicators, which, and I think I'm a bit worried that we might lose the information on the duplicates. Because at a certain point, as we did in SDG process as well, we went by dividing targets into indicators, but then there are indicators which run across many targets. And I think if we lose information on the duplicates, we might lose the basis of having indicators moving in, speaking to different targets within the GGA. The second thing is that while no matter what methodology we follow, the tiering system we have done in Sendai and SDG is very important. First tier being methodology, second tier being data. An indicator that has both makes the first cut. An indicator that has data, methodology but no data, yes. If they have neither, strong recommendation not to select unless there is a very strong political imperative to select it, because then that requires massive investment to develop the methodology and then roll it out to collect the data. At the end, something which I have been saying through the GLASS process, keep the target setting process a political process and indicator setting process a technical process. We are all at disposal of the wisdom of the parties, but the technical sanctity, the statistical sanctity of indicators is also very important. Otherwise, we will end up losing the purpose with which we started it. Thanks.
Thank you, Animesh. Any final closing thoughts? I know we're really late on time, and I might say let's, we'll... Yeah, please.
I think just to add on quickly to say that I think the work is very big for experts. It's just 7 experts working in something that we want really positive outcome from, and so it's also an open process. So I think if you are here and you are interested, I think you should reach out to experts, and if you have any support to give to the process, I think that would be super helpful. So that's what I wanted to add on. Thank you.
Fantastic. A good plea. And I know we have several technical experts in the room. I'm just going to say raise your hands if you're an official technical expert so that folks know who to talk to and who to reach out to. All right, we're going to move to our next panel, except our speaker has moved. Oh, there's Cinta. Okay, sorry, I thought we lost one of our panelists. Thank you so much to this panel of technical experts. A round of applause. If we could get a quick picture, and Neha, we'd like to include you in this picture if you don't mind turning on your camera. We'll make sure you're... Okay. Neha, if you could look in the camera, please, in your camera. Thank you. All right, let's get started with our next panel. I'd like to welcome Dr. Zinta Zummers. She's Vice Chair of Working Group 2 of the IPCC, and also lead for climate science at the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. I'm not going to do a detailed bio in the interest of time, but it is distinguished. And next we have Joyce Kimutai, who is a research associate in the analysis and interpretation of climate data for extreme weather. She completed her PhD under AXA Research Chair Program in African Climate Risk as part of a multidisciplinary team at the University of Cape Town and Oxford University. Welcome to both of you. We're here to hear a bit more about the IPCC AR7 cycle, these guidelines that have been mentioned, and where you see this global goal on adaptation framework and indicators kind of fitting in with the IPCC process.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for the very informative updates on your hard work with GGA, and I'm really thankful that you're going through that, because I don't think I could stomach 1,000 indicators and looking at them. But so just quickly to tell you a little bit more about the IPCC and the plans for the next cycle. First about the guidelines. Now the guidelines, you can look it up online. They were drafted in 1994, so clearly they're over 30 years old and certainly in need of an update. Now, what are the guidelines? I think that's important to understand. They're not an assessment of current impacts. They're not an assessment of levels of adaptation. They literally were explanation of the methods used for adaptation, planning, and risk assessments. So, for example, the sections cover definition of methods, selection of scenarios, assessment of biophysical and socioeconomic impacts, ways to monitor autonomous adjustment, and ways to develop adaptation strategies. Now, in a few weeks, the IPCC will be meeting in Malaysia in a scoping meeting, and some of the members here will be participating in that, where we'll be outlining what will be included in this update. But I think it's important to note that it's very much, as the title indicates, a technical guideline on adaptation methods. Now, obviously, over the last 30 years, there's been a lot of progress. The NAPs include methods. People are doing adaptation analysis and risk assessments. So we have lots to include. There's also a question of whether or not we'll include loss and damage there, or if that stays out. Where do we go? What's included? I certainly think that this method paper relates almost more to the GGA, the process-based kind of goals, about how do you plan for adaptation. This, I think, IPCC report would have more impact on that. But it's open for all of those in Malaysia to decide whether or not, for example, we might have subcategories on health, food systems, et cetera, as articulated in the GGA. Now, I also certainly don't think that a guideline we will get into, certainly we need to link to indicators, but I don't see how a guideline could articulate how you do the methods for 1,000 indicators. So that's where something such as a task force on adaptation might be better suited in terms of collecting that data, looking at providing details on methods for each indicator. I don't think that doesn't go into a paper or PDF document. So those are kind of outstanding questions about how do we best link to all of this. But certainly they will influence each other. And just quickly before I end, I don't know if we can bring up slides. We might have some slides here. Let me just see. They might put them on just for those of you who are interested in the IPCC and engaging. So obviously in this cycle, it just started and it will end by 2029 or 2030. That is also yet to be decided. But we have, first and foremost, the special report on cities. The process is just beginning with the selection of authors. We have an outline. Then there will be the 7th assessment cycle reports, which is Working Group 1, the physical science, 2, obviously adaptation and impacts, and Working Group 3, mitigation. And with a synthesis report that combines all three, the dates for that are yet to be determined. And then finally, we have this update on adaptation guidelines. So that also will be kind of released concurrently. Obviously, there's a strong call for all of them for really action-oriented reports, something that's really relevant to decision-making, and a strong integration between the working groups so that that work informs each other. And the real call to engage not just scientists, but practitioners. So those of you who are working, be it in the private sector or public sector or non-governmental organizations. And finally, just a quick note. Yes, and obviously we want to have much more information on risks and trade-offs and how to finance all of this. And how can you get involved? You can get involved as an expert in the scoping. There's pre-scoping webinars. There'll be opportunities to be authors, obviously. There'll be professionals can help review the reports. Stakeholder networks can also help with the review and the outreach, producing fact sheets, better ways to kind of share the results in more simplified methods, because obviously the IPCC results are often very long and boring. And the scientists, obviously all of you who are here, should definitely also make sure that you publish relevant information on questions like indicators and obviously the global goal on adaptation. So we look forward to working with you in the next cycle, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks so much for that overview, Zinta. Quick question for clarification. I know it will be important to people in this room. By when do you need to publish to get into the next cycle?
Yeah, that will depend on when the report is released, and that is a political decision that's going to be heavily fought over in a few months. So if it's 2028 or 2029, obviously the cutoff is usually a year and a half before the release of the report. So once we have those reports out, just make sure you work backwards and try to get your information. The reports, just to be clear, will hopefully articulate the outline, so you'll know what the topics are and where they're going to be looking for information. And then you can hopefully know roughly when they'll be published, and just try to make sure it's done about a year and a half before.
Great. Let me hand the microphone over to Joyce.
Thank you. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us and for those who organized this important event, and Zinta as well for your comments. And also really the panel before us, I think very informative information on the GGA process. Thank you so much. So I think as we speak about the synergies between what is happening under the UNFCCC and with the IPCC with this new report that will be scoped in a few weeks from now and expected to be out in a few years from now, is that one thing that the Zinta emphasized, and I think I'll reiterate, is the fact that the guidelines themselves are very 1994 at the moment. So really it's been 30 years, it's just about guidelines, and I think Zinta's outline has read through sort of the outline, or rather the topics that they looked at that particular time, and you find that to some extent, to a large extent, they are really not very relevant to the current process. How we look at adaptation at this particular point in time. And so I think there's really room for collaboration, as Zinta, you as well mentioned, stakeholder engagement. So I think there's really room for collaborating. So speaking, I'm thinking, starting with the scoping next month, is to see how people who are engaged in the UNFCCC process can be able to speak or engage with experts that are starting to engage with the IPCC process, the writing. So, because basically what will happen with that report, what that guidelines is that we want to, I hope that we would, I mean, as authors or as IPCC or wherever, I mean, it's not me, but I hope what IPCC would want to look at is whether we still want to maintain that report as is or have a complete overhaul of that report. And I think for me, I'm in the favor of the latter. And I know it will be a lot of work, it's enormous work, but I think if we really want to have a product that would support the current policy process, and mainly the GGA, we should put in some effort in reworking on that. And I think then it will really have the and I think that engagement with experts it would really inform even writing papers and starting to see what exactly is the information that we need to assess and write, and it's on evidence, it's on metrics, so things that we think can support the discussion on indicators. So the other thing that I think I add from the first interventions on the first panel was on attribution. So basically trying to establish evidence base or linking impacts to climate change. And for sure, attribution has certainly made us understand how impacts occurring in different places, I mean, hazards are affecting sort of impacts in different places in different forms. So of course it interacts with factors on the ground like vulnerability, exposure and all that, but for sure with the understanding of the changes in the frequencies and intensities of extreme events, we've seen how this has impacted communities very differently. And I think that understanding is very important, and the methods of trying to understand to what extent is climate change linked to the particular impacts are a topic that is really under discussion at the moment in the scientific community. So the methods are evolving, so they're still at their sort of more of their infancy stage, but I think they're evolving over time. And I think there is room maybe on this report to have a section on attribution impacts, maybe just even talking about where are the methods, what exactly, how do we want to do that, and how will they support sort of the discussion and the GGA. And the other thing that I would wanted to highlight as well is on inventorizing impacts. There's a really huge challenge on that at the moment. I think Animation and I have had this conversation many times with the new platform on this Inventor. I think what we're getting now with MDAT is that it's not really covering many regions. It's not covering assets. I looked at it recently, and it only talks about, for the last 30 years, only 3 heatwave events in Africa. And so it's really underrepresenting sort of the impacts that are occurring in regions. And oh, sorry. So MDAS, I'm so sorry. So this is a database of impacts. So they look at disaster cost impacts. So it's not entirely climate related. It could be other non-climate disasters, but I think it's just they inventorize. So it's a database of impacts. And so I think having a collaborative effort towards having a rich database, or working towards inventorizing as many impacts as possible, is that then you'll have a better representation and understanding of impacts in regions, and also how these impacts are changing over time. And you avoid the risk of having some impacts go underreported or underrepresented, and for sure it means communities or policies will not be able to be formulated in a way that communities can adapt to those impacts. Because if it's underreported, it's underdocumented, it means it's also not analyzed. Communities are not aware of them. We don't know how it impacts humans or livestock or people or food or all that. So really trying to have information of impacts across regions is quite important. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Joyce. I'm going to open it up for questions and answers in just a second, but maybe just to ask a question. I mean, we've heard about the GGA framework and how it could be reflected in the IPCC, potentially as an organizing frame within the guidelines, some of the elements that have been tricky within the indicator discussion maybe being picked up in the methodologies. We've also heard about potentially the task force that might be on adaptation that might be asked for or invited by parties as part of the GGA decision from this COP. But there's also the broader IPCC Working Group 2 report and ways in which the GGA could be reflected within that. So yeah, any thoughts on any of these things and where GGA can be further reflected, integrated into IPCC Working Group 2? Joyce, I'll start with you.
I'll just quickly comment on the task force on adaptation. I think initially when this idea was fronted, I think it was quite ambitious in the first place. But I think many parties agreed that maybe as a start is to look at these guidelines, the 1994 guidelines, and see whether we want to update them, revise them, and in what way is that possible. And but I think really the goal is to have that task force on adaptation. I think we will learn a lot from the process of updating these guidelines. The report that IPCC will produce will shed light on what, just experience of working through that, and within what is happening with GGA now. How many indicators do we entirely nail to have, and how does that inform the different adaptation pathways in the national level? So, as Animesh said, it's more of global targets, not global goal, but then the pathways will be very localized. It's really communities saying how can they work, how can they do their own adaptation, maybe determined on the national adaptation plans that countries are put in place to see how they can achieve that overall goal that we've set for ourselves. So I think overall, through this process, at the end of it, it will be very clear for the community, whether it's through the IPCC or the UNFCCC putting out a call asking explicitly IPCC to establish the task force, or parties under the IPCC really requesting for such a task force within the process. So I think after this process that will be more clearer, but I think we are in the right direction.
Zinta.
Yeah, I think maybe just about the Working Group 2 report, that also will be scoped in Malaysia. There's certainly a lot of ways that the GGA can inform that. Again, as an organizing principle, perhaps. We already historically have thematic chapters that would be relevant to the GGA, so I don't think it's and the IPCC indeed informed the GGA and the selection of the GGA. So it's not, I think we can continue along that route. But just to flag that also the Working Group 2 report also goes much beyond the GGA and adaptation. There's also risks and a whole chapter on risks, current impacts and the assessment of current impacts. And particularly in this cycle, there's going to be much more focus on loss and damage. So, and when it comes to adaptation, there's the question of obviously indicators the GGA is dealing with in the cycle of planning, but we really need to look at the effectiveness and the feasibility of our adaptation actions in the context of rising temperatures. So I think the Working Group 2 report will definitely be relevant to the GGA, but also go beyond it.
Great points. Any questions from the audience? We have a little bit of time. Didhi, and then I'll go.
Very briefly, and this is kind of a larger question, but something perhaps the task force and the whole adaptation research community can look at. I think the tension that Animesh mentioned between SDGs and adaptation are development really different from adaptation. And I think we do not have and that's the same thing that is seeped in through the GGA process with reservations on whether we should or shouldn't use indicators from other existing processes. So maybe that would be something that we as an adaptation research community would need to come to some kind of convergence, or we might just remain divergent, but some discussions is needed. I don't know how the rest of the room feels about that.
We'll get some questions and we'll input, but I think there are different points of view here on that. Lucy, and then we'll come to you, sir.
So thank you so much for this excellent side event. I think it has been really good to hear the views and also to hear the reflections from the different people. Myself, I'm supporting the food and agriculture target as one of the experts for the GGA process. And I'm also and my name is Lucy Njuguna. I work for the Alliance of Biodiversity and CEAT. And I'm also very keen in engaging in contributing to the updates of the IPCC Technical Guidelines, especially with an eye to seeing how we can make it even more suit for purpose for the GGA process. But then I'm also keen to understand, is there also an interest to make the guidelines suitable to guide the measurement of adaptation for other stakeholders? Because we know the GGA framework, as was explained at the beginning, it's supposed to help us have this global overview of adaptation process, which means we also need a bit more of coherence in how different stakeholders are measuring adaptation. So it's both for governments have their reporting to the UNFCCC, but it's also how do we bring in the private sector, for example? How do we make sure that the technical guidelines can also potentially address this demand? And then the second point is maybe just picking up on what Zinta you mentioned. It might not be feasible to get into the details of the methods of measuring each indicator in the technical guidelines. So then I'm wondering, is there an opportunity for other organizations, especially in this case, let's say the CGIAR, which works a lot on methods, how can they be able to complement that so that the technical guidelines can be probably high level in providing the guidance, but then we can find a way to tap into what other methods are being developed by the research community, for example. And then finally, what might there be the opportunities for young researchers to engage in the development of the technical guidelines? Will there be a separate team from the working group to a team of others that will be probably be delegated to work on the technical guidelines? Because I feel like this is also such a niche topic. So maybe then how can other people be able to engage? Or do you need to be in the pool of the whole working group, group of others for you to work on the technical guidelines? Thank you. Oh, and then I had one more final final question. Sorry, this is so interesting to me. I have too many questions. I know the focus now is on how to respond to the current discussion on the GGA indicators, but we know there's also the discussion that is going on about the TORs for the review of the framework, which will come maybe a couple of years and will probably align even better with the time when the technical guidelines will be finalized. So can we maybe also keep an eye to maybe even look at, are there other elements that have been missed out with the 7 thematic targets? What type of interlinkages are there, and could the GGA Framework 2.0 be improved in certain ways? Thank you.
Okay, Lucy, lots of questions, but good, really good ones. So we have the climate and development divide. We have the guidelines speaking to other stakeholders beyond governments like the private sector. We have how do you get involved in the rewriting of the guidelines, and the timing of the review of the GGA, and to what extent maybe the IPCC can feed in to improve that review process. Last question.
Thank you very much. My name is Marcus Taylor. I'll keep it very quick. What do you think? I know that your background is working with interdisciplinary teams, and one of the very positive aspects of AR6 was the incorporation of a more social science bent in with this kind of broad but shallow in terms of context indicators vis-a-vis the kind of social science working perhaps from a more grassroots level, which tends to be very deep in terms of context, but very narrow in terms of application. There must be a bliss point there. So I was wondering how you saw that relationship perhaps developing in the next cycle, both importance for impacts of climate change and vulnerability, but also who can work with adaptation. Much of the social science studies coming out now show that communities can be quite fragmented, and this kind of assumption of the community can be in some circumstances a little problematic. Many people within a particular community are much more able to work with public or private adaptation measures and others that get left behind. So capturing some of that context specificity, how do you see that playing out in this next cycle? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so question on the bliss point between the deep and narrow, or superficial and broad involvement of the social science, and I guess this is especially important for the guidance, as that will direct how, for instance, work with communities takes place. Zinta, do you want to start? Then.
Yeah, maybe just to touch on 2 points, both the involvement of social scientists and the private sector. So certainly a lot of that comes into play when we choose the authors, and so keep your eyes open for the call for nominations, and then each government has a different way of selecting who they nominate. Some countries give everybody, some have an internal selection, but at that point it's obviously as important as possible that a wide range of people from a variety of sectors applies. From the Bureau side, of course, we're eager to ensure diversity, both of expertise and of region and gender, etc. It also partly what we look for will depend on the outline, which will again be scoped here, but just because you're not participating doesn't mean that you don't have a role to play. I think that usually the outlines are released, kind of made public, a few months later on the IPCC website, and it will inform again the plenary that's forthcoming in March, where they decide the timeline, but then governments also vote on the outline. And to be perfectly fair, governments play around with outlines and stick things in and ask for things to be removed. So if you really are passionate about a topic and you don't see it there, then it's just really important to, through your community, reach out to your government focal points and try to make sure that they then suggest that things are added or taken out. So there are multiple ways to influence the process, and certainly would encourage all of you to do that. And yes, we very much, in Working Group 2, we have had the broader representation, not just physical scientists, but very much, social scientists, and we continue to want and welcome that.
Yeah, I think Zint has answered all the sort of IPCC-related questions, and I think I just wanted to comment the question or respond to what Aditi. It's a big question, Aditi. I don't think I have an answer, but I think I just try to comment in my own understanding. I think currently, because of all what we're doing with trying to understand I mean, basically, it's really just trying to understand progress in adaptation, what we're doing. I think it's been a long time, adaptation being fragmented, very sectoral specific, very incremental as well. And even and it's in all areas. It's finance, it's implementation, it's in all areas. So I think it's at the moment it looks like we're doing a lot of things. So much is happening, but to me it doesn't feel enormous in that sense. To me it feels like we are actually, because a lot of people said, oh, it's going to be very difficult to measure adaptation. It's going to be very difficult to develop, to have indicators that speaks to every context, to every situations and countries. And that's it's understandable. I mean, that concern is valid. But I think it's really about, if you look at it critically with what we have now with the Task Force on Greenhouse Gas Inventories. It was started in 1998. It's been many iterations of what are the methodologies, how can we do this better? Scientific community coming together. It's been many IPCC cycle processes and so basically saying that it's been, people are learning from the experiences, they're looking at overlaps and synergies with other processes, refining ways of doing things. So I think that is why it's important really to go for this, the Task Force on Adaptation, and I think it's a good thing to go for because we are setting ourselves up for all this. So we are saying, for example, we want to bring the community to understand these things better. What do we mean by development? Do we have adaptation in there? What are the indicators? So I mean, we are basically saying that we are, we're basically saying to ourselves that we have these very enormous tasks ahead of us, but then we are trying to approach this in a more structured way that maybe in the next few years we'll be having a very different discussion on what global goal on adaptation means.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That's a great point to end on. I want to thank both of you for being part of the panel and for really bringing in the IPCC voice and process into this. So a round of applause for our second panel. And I think I hand it over now to Aditi to do closing. Oh. Oh. Sure, happy to try and summarize, although it has been such a really rich discussion, it's going to be difficult. I think a couple of big themes jumped out for me in terms of hearing both the interplay between the first and the second panel. This issue of climate and development and what's the difference between GGA indicators and development indicators and how we handle that and then how that then gets reflected into the IPCC. I think there's room for both, and it's not an either or sort of situation, but it's how do we ensure that we're capturing the climate context, that climate attribution, that climate signal, if you will, the adaptation signal, and looking at practical ways of measuring progress and learning as we're going along. So I think that was one big issue. The big issue of, and then the science and evidence base that we use that is available and that is developed and developing to do that, I think is really critical for both the GGA and the IPCC to help provide that evidence base. The issue of methodologies and data and data readiness. Again, the IPCC has experience doing this on greenhouse gas emissions, and could we learn from the model of a task force and have a task force on adaptation to really provide more of that methodological support and learning over time. You know, another big question, but an interplay between both frameworks. And then the GGA and the UAE framework as a general organizing theme and organizing principle. I mean, we've already seen so much happen just in the past year with the UAE framework since it's been launched. The water community has gotten together to develop definitions using the GGA targets where they didn't have those definitions before. Universities are starting to do research again according to those categories, which hopefully will feed into the IPCC. So I think there's also like, how do we use this new framework that we've agreed to globally and committed to as an organizing principle, and then use it to and then use the IPCC as an opportunity to learn and feedback and have even a stronger and better framework in the future. So those were just a couple of the themes that jumped out at me. I'm sure I'm missing a lot of important points. But really just want to say thank you to our panelists for a great discussion, audience for being here and asking tough questions and good questions, and our speakers, of course, and the CGIAR for hosting us today. So thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Christina. I think as a researcher who was involved in the previous IPCC cycle and also a part of this GGA group, what really jumps out to me and is really the need for adaptation research has been either very rich, very context specific, and then there has also been a plethora of concepts that are very academic, and then, you know, on the ground people struggle with it, like what is even maladaptation, what is transformative adaptation. So I feel that we have, as a community, have to rise up to the challenge and make it more practical, because these, our thematic indicators, like basically having those thematic indicators actually shows priorities of the parties, that food, water, health, those are some of the day-to-day things that they are grappling with when they face climate challenge, right? And I feel that there's an enormous responsibility among the adaptation researchers to literally come out from the academic setting and be more practical and do things that then a party or a country can actually see and see, okay, this is what you mean by adaptation. These are complex things, but this is what I am taking back from this, that for the next 2 to 3 years, we have to really get down and publish as much as possible and kind of offer a perspective that is research for development, more practical, bottom-up, etc. So thank you again. A wonderful panel. I understand that it was also the lunchtime, so food always has a priority over intellectual discussions. So our previous panel was like full, but I think that this topic was just as important, but it's just that the food security of each one of us always trumps everything else. But thank you again for being with us, and thank you, Christina, for absolutely fantastic moderation and all the speakers. Thank you so much. We have some of our panelists have left. For those of us who are still here, we'll take a photo.